Hi guys, we'll be starting off on week 2 this week, and we're jumping a little further into chapter 1. And I just wanted to give you kind of a background information that you may not get from the book. So if you go onto Canvas and you're getting ready to start this week's module, come to your home page and you'll click on the modules here, and it will take you to your list. And one thing you'll notice as you go through these modules, you can always shut them down if they're all showing up. So here in week 2, starting on January 23rd, and it will go through with the assignments due by February 1st. And you can wander through. So some of the objectives and requirements for this week are listed here for you to kind of read through. I won't go through all of those. So you can wander through and look at that. And what you'll notice this week is the lecture is actually here listed for you, so you can click on and open up the lecture. I have a downloadable, see if I can move that over for you. I have a downloadable form of this lecture, so if you wanted to download it and as you're doing your reading, that can be helpful. But it's all listed on here for you. So you're not going to be required to turn in anything on this. It's really to help you just sort of focus in on, as you're reading through the book, what are you trying to gain from it. So I've got some blanks on there for you to kind of go through, and the same information is going to be on that downloadable portion there. Okay, so what I really like to do though is take a moment to talk a little bit about what is not in the book and give you some of my personal expertise and some of the things that you're missing by not being in the live, well, not missing, but because you're getting them now, but some of the things that you're not going to get because you're not in the live class. So one of the topics I'd like to start off with is this definition of the term nutritionism, and to compare nutritionism versus nutrition science. So take just a minute and think about it. What comes to mind when I say nutritionism? And I've had a variety of things from the students that will respond to me on this one, and anywhere from, just to focus on nutrients, or somebody who's obsessed with nutrition, to, I don't know, a whole variety of other things. So the actual definition of it, nutritionism, it's this idea that eating is scientific, and so we're eating specifically to nourish our body, not really because of the food, but because of the nutrients that are in the food. So basically the nutritional value of a food is the sum of all of its individual nutrients. So we're really just focused in on nutrients, and we're not looking at foods. And that the only point of eating is to promote bodily health. And I don't know about you guys, but I think the point of eating is to enjoy the foods that I'm having. So there's a variety of reasons to eat, but that may not always be one of them. And so because of this, and we'll talk a little bit about where this came from and why nutritionism, we've seen such a rise in it. We've gone to this really labeling nutrients as either good or evil, right? You've got good carbs or bad carbs, good fat or bad fat. And they've coined this disease as orthorexia. So orthorexia being somebody who is obsessed with foods one considers are healthy. And I can think of people who are like that. They're not a lot of fun to be around because that's all they think about. If you're sitting down to eat, they're looking at, I should have this, or you shouldn't be eating that, or they like to give advice regarding that. I probably don't have it so much, but I have talked with people who deal with people who are just obsessed with their food. So I hope I don't create that in you this semester. That's not my point. My whole motto in all of this is why make easy hard? Make eating enjoyable and eat good food too. So where did this come from? So we first discovered the nutrients late 1800s. Nutrition is a fairly young science. And in the late 1800s, what do you think were considered the evil nutrients? So when they were looking at nutrients, it would be carbohydrate, fat, protein, maybe the vitamins or minerals, but they labeled them as either good or evil. And as it turns out, in the late 1800s, they're obviously not on our bandwagon in this generation, but the evil nutrients were protein. So as we move forward to the 1900s, Henry Kellogg had mistakenly come up with these flaked grains. Originally they were wheat grains, and decided that they were rather tasty, and ultimately to corn, which was even more tasty because it's a bit sweeter. And he capitalized on this whole thought of evil nutrients because the majority of people in that time frame were having very protein-rich breakfast. They were having, eggs and bacon and sausage, and, they lived on the farms and they needed this energy to sustain them. But protein's an evil nutrient. So it played into this rise of the breakfast cereal. I don't know how many of you out there now eat breakfast cereal, but we sort of take it for granted that that's the healthy thing to do. So kind of the start of nutritionism. So using nutrition knowledge to promote, maybe for good, sometimes maybe for financial purposes. And as we move to present day, some of the things that we see out there that some of the people or companies that are benefiting would be people who are in journalism, the media. And I'm hoping that not many of you are watching this guy, but I'm going to give you a video clip later to kind of help you understand better why maybe not to watch this guy. There was an article that came out, I think it was 2 years ago in Time magazine. There was one study that was done that refuted 50 years of research showing that saturated fat increases cholesterol, increases heart disease. But there was one study that came out that kind of put into question whether or not saturated fat was bad for you. And so the media loves controversy. I mean, they sold, millions because of this one study that came out that really didn't stand the test of time. So part of the reason nutrition becomes very confusing and it feels like there's a lot of flip-flop is because these guys all have a lot of money to make based on the nutritionism that they're using. The other people that make money because of this focus on nutrients would definitely be the food industry. So blueberries, study after study, berries, blueberries, I think it's the acai juice. People have promoted as being, the wonder juice out there, and the public will spend tons of money on these things. And so you take a blueberry, there's good evidence. Yes, blueberries are good for you. But when you put them into a cereal and they're all dehydrated like that, I'm not sure that's the same thing that came from the research. But nonetheless, people will see this, they see the packaging, and they buy it. When we go back historically and we really look at, we had some of this rise from the cereal, we can look at that. But the turning point that most historians will look at, where we really stopped looking at groups of foods and food patterns and actually food itself, was back in 1977 when Senator McGovern put together a committee to really look at, we had some rises in heart disease following World War II. So if you think back into your history knowledge, what was going on in this country around that time during World War II that might have impacted that. So we had a decrease in heart disease during World War II, and there was a lot of food rationing going on. So there was very little red meat, very little dairy allowed during that time. We saw this decrease. But as soon as World War II was finished, we had a heyday in terms of what went on in this country, and food followed along with that. And our intakes of a variety of foods increased. So Senator McGovern convened this group of scientists to say, what's going on? Why are we seeing these rates of heart disease? We really want to focus on the promotion of health for our public. And basically what they found is that, we were eating a lot more protein. And this protein intake, red meat in particular, and dairy, these increases in intakes seem to correlate with this heart disease. So the initial recommendation from this committee was to put out to the public a very easy to understand message: eat less red meat. But the cattle industry was not very fond of the thought that we were going to, as a government, put out a recommendation to kill their profits. So due to politics, even back then, the meat industry got involved in that. The food industry basically stopped that message and sort of changed it. So as you're looking at the change in the message, eat less red meat, which is very understandable and doable, they changed it over to choose meats that will reduce your intake of saturated fat. And back in the 70s, nobody knew what saturated fat was, but they also included in here choose meats. And so there really was no more change in that. And actually, I'm not sure that did much good, other than the fact that we started now focusing in on this key term here, saturated fat. So from that, we had this rise of just explosion of nutritionism. And so what we found is that nutrients became an acceptable way to look at food. So the food industry could now put on their packaging, right, saturated fat free. They could sell foods, and we've seen that, over the next several decades, cholesterol free. And in this day and age, you could say even GMOs free or gluten free. So we're focused on these nutrients, and it does two things. One, it labels foods that tell you it has less saturated fat, which is good. But on the flip side, people look at those foods and think they must be healthy because they don't have these certain components in it, and they sell more of them. And the cost oftentimes will go up, as what you would find in oftentimes a gluten-free product. So when we're talking about nutrition science, we do look at the specific nutrients, and you will look at the specific nutrients over the next 17 weeks. But as a nutritionist, what we learn from is really doing studies, so doing epidemiological studies, looking at whole foods and how they interact. And that's where a lot of this information is going to come from. So the science of nutrition itself is really a field of knowledge composed of organized facts. And nutrition's evolving. It's been around for a little over 100 years. So the information that we gain from it continues to evolve, and so we're evolving that information. So what we know today may evolve to some extent as we learn more about the body and what we're doing in terms of understanding the genetics and how the interaction is there. The nutrition science and the research that you see out there does go through this process of the scientific method. So you can read about that in the book, and I won't go too much into it here because you can read about it, but it does go through this process. You'll also read a little bit in the book about the different types of research design, so some of them have a little more validity than others. The one thing I want to point out, though, is, just because a research study comes out does not necessarily mean you should change your diet based on one study. The typical nutrition recommendations are bodies of evidence that have come out. So there's often times where they'll have research that ultimately is discounted. So I would just dissuade you from looking at one body of evidence. If you're able to, I don't know if you can click to it from here. I just have a clip on here in terms of the placebo effect. And just quickly to talk about that, placebo effect can have a huge impact on how you feel. So in other words, you think that you're taking something that's going to make you feel stronger, therefore you do feel stronger, and the placebo effect is extremely effective. And actually in my own practice as a dietitian, as a clinician, I don't have a real problem with it if it doesn't hurt somebody, but oftentimes the placebo effect is financially, there's financial incentives for the people that are selling you the placebo. So just so you know, there is a whole body of evidence. We call it the evidence-based nutrition guidelines. There's a library that's accessible to myself as a dietitian. I don't believe the public can get onto it. And so all of medicine has gone in this direction of evidence-based guidelines, and nutrition is no different. And the way these work, so what evidence-based guidelines are is we're looking at the recommendations anywhere from, body mass index, the types of diet that help with weight loss, the types of procedures that might help with weight loss, to iron deficiency, to, whatever you might think of in terms of nutrition. And they go through a process to come up with this evidence. So as you're looking at this, it's a 5-step process. Basically, they come up with what their question is. And then they gather professionals, dietitians, physicians, nurses, epidemiologists, to look at the research that's out there and to classify each research article. Every research article has its own merits and drawbacks. So they rate the research that's out there, and they put together a comprehensive rating of these recommendations based on the evidence that's out there. So let me take you through, I'm going to click through this to something you might be able to read. So for example, very controversial, and we'll talk a lot about this with chapter as we get into the weight balance chapter, but body mass index, should we use it as a classification for overweight or obesity? And the recommendations there are that it's a fair or imperative, so it's showing you right here, fair or imperative. There are some problems with body mass index. If we have an individual with a high amount of muscle mass, they are going to come in as being overweight, which they're not. So, but the general population, the excess weight that they have is probably not an issue of muscle mass. It's probably a matter of having extra body fat. So this is how they go through, and they will give these ratings for each recommendation that might be out there. So that's how we go about the evidence-based nutrition guidelines. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And if you have questions on any of this, please feel free to email me, and I hope that kind of helps get you started on this chapter.